Welcome to DIYeasycrafts.com. Today we're going to take a look at how to make this fishing themed tabletop hook it game. Now I just used some scrap wood that I had in the garage. This is 2 pieces of 1x6 pine and a 1/4 inch piece of plywood that I glued in between. I just used wood glue. I used all of my artistic ability to draw a fish's head coming out of the water. You can note that I am not much of an artist here. I used a pin saw to just cut out the outline of that fish's head, but you could certainly just use a jigsaw. And I'm going to do the majority of the carving with an angle grinder or a disc grinder. I'm using a 36 grit flap sanding wheel. So this moves a lot of material very quickly, but if you have some control over that disc grinder, if you don't apply that much pressure, you can also do some fairly fine work with it. Just be careful, you really don't want to grind your fingers with this thing. And all I'm doing is I'm just tapering in the head of the fish towards the front, and then also towards the bottom, and eventually I'll do towards the top. And you can see now what I'm doing is I'm grinding away or grinding down that dorsal fin, so that the dorsal fin is thinner than the rest of the fish. So again, you don't have to be much of an artist. You just want to get the general shape of a fish. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece. It just has to visually represent a fish's head coming out of the water. I used just a handheld sander, 80 grit paper, just to smooth out some of the rough edges from that disc grinder. And you could just continue to look at this thing and make small improvements on it. I used a Dremel grinder with a little round bit just to grind away some of the material from inside the fish's mouth. And I used a drum sanding wheel in order to shape the dorsal fin. Any little details that you can add, really will enhance the finished product. I used just a 3/8 drill, partially drilled through on each side in order to create the illusion of the eyes. And I went back to the Dremel just with a cutoff wheel to create the gills. Just an arced line. So the fish head is pretty much done. I'm going to eventually put a real fishing hook into that mouth, and the ring from the hookitgame will catch on the shaft of that fishing hook. Now I didn't want to paint this fish, and what I did was I ended up staining it with a green stain, and this is something that I made just with some modeler's paint and some stain. I mixed the two and created my own green wood stain. And after I stained it and dried it, I did give it a few coats of a clear lacquer so that it would have a shiny look to it. I darkened the inside of the eyes and the mouth just with a black Sharpie. So I'm moving on to the fishing pole itself. I'm using a 3/16 brass rod that I had in the garage. You can get this at Ace Hardware. I wanted to taper it a little bit. Fishing poles are thin at the top and thick at the base. I just inserted that rod into my drill and used a little sandpaper and went back and forth for a few minutes. Brass is very easy to work, so it doesn't take long, and you don't have to taper it down to a needle point, just to give the illusion of a fishing rod. I bent it just on my grinder. It had a nice curved area, I guess about an 8-inch diameter. So I just bent that right around. In order to create the eye loops on the fishing pole, I took a small piece of wire, bent it around a shaft, and then I bent a 90-degree angle on that. And I'll clip off the other end so that it's doesn't have to be all that long. So this is going to fit on the fishing pole, and I'm going to lash that and tie that into position with some black thread. And I'll use some Elmer's glue just to hold that in place. And then once the Elmer's glue is dried, I epoxied it with a 2-part epoxy. For the fishing reel itself, I just used a wooden dowel. I think it was about a 1/2 inch. I glued 2 washers, one onto each side. And then I took another piece of a wooden dowel, ground a 1/2 inch on one side and 3/16 on the other. And I'm going to glue that right onto the fishing pole with some 2-part epoxy. So here are the eyes, and you can see that I'm going to rig this with actual braided fishing line. That's the fishing reel. For the base, I wanted to, instead of just painting it blue, I figured I might as well make a nice ocean effect. I'm using Total Boat's Maker Epoxy. It's a really cool epoxy. I mixed up a batch and then put a little dark blue into 1 cup, some ocean green into another. I kept some clear and then a little bit of white for the froth on the waves. And I've done a whole video, or actually done several videos on making these, ocean waves, cutting boards, and all sorts of other things. A very easy, fun project on its own. So I've added the blue as the base. I added the green. I'm going to add some clear, and then a row of white on the edge of the wood and the clear. And then I'm going to use a hairdryer to blow the white kind of over the clear. And really gives it a cool effect. And at the same time, it heats up the resin a little bit, and you end up with this, really nice cell structure once it's dried. And this whole process really doesn't take, all that long. You do have to let this, or I did have to let this dry overnight, 24 hours before I could work with it any further. And then once it was dry, I sanded off the sides, any of the drippings that came down or ended up on the back. But look at the cell structure to the waves. So again, this is Total Boat's Maker Epoxy. And you can check that out on totalboat.com. So I took the fishing pole, I drilled a 3/16 hole through the base at an angle. I glued that into position with some 2-part epoxy, and I positioned the fish, basically where I wanted it. I've got that fishing pole rigged with braided line. At the base of that, on the back side, I used the Dremel grinder with a cutoff wheel, and I cut into the board, also into the bottom end of that brass shaft. So, and then I just clipped off a little electrical fitting here. I'm going to insert that into the slot. So it's almost like a screwdriver slot in that brass shaft. And this piece is going to give it a little bit of leverage. I'm going to glue that all together with a 2-part epoxy. And hopefully then that very tall fishing pole is not going to have a tendency of twisting or breaking free from its epoxy. I used a white silicone and a single screw to attach the fish's head to the base material. And then I used some additional white silicone just to create the wave effect. So this is the finished product. It's a tabletop hookitgame. It's definitely going to require a little bit of skill. The ring is just a keychain ring, and it's actually going to catch onto the shaft end of a fluke hook that I've just inserted right into that fish's mouth. This is the fishing pole with the reel and fishing line and the eyelets on the pole. I definitely need a little bit of practice at this before I become an expert, but you can get the gist of it. A fun little project. Not only the ocean wave, but the wood stain are all things I've done in the past, but on this one I kind of combined it all into one. I hope you enjoyed the video. I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I would absolutely love it if you took a minute and left a message in the comments section letting me know how you like this. And by all means, check us out on the web at DIYeasycrafts.com. Thank you very much.